When a racist diner owner refuses to serve a black customer, he unknowingly sets off a chain of events that will unravel his family's darkest secrets. As he digs into his father's past, he discovers a shocking truth that forces him to confront his deepest prejudices and redefine everything he thought he knew about family, identity, and redemption. Chapter 1: The Diner Incident. Scene 1: The routine morning. The sun was just beginning to rise over the small southern town, casting a soft golden light across the quiet streets. Mitchell Carter pushed open the door of his diner, the familiar chime of the bell above the door signaling the start of another day. The diner had been his life for as long as he could remember. It was the one constant in his world, a place where he knew exactly what to expect and how to handle every situation. He moved with practiced ease, flipping on the lights and beginning his morning routine. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as he started the first pot of the day. The sizzle of bacon on the griddle soon followed, mixing with the scent of homemade biscuits baking in the oven. Mitchell glanced out the window as the first rays of sunlight streamed in, illuminating the checkered floor and red vinyl booths that lined the walls. The diner was a relic of the past, a place that hadn't changed much in the decades since his mother had first opened it. The regulars began to trickle in, nodding their usual greetings as they took their seats. Mitchell exchanged polite smiles and brief conversations as he served up their usual orders. This was his world, predictable, controlled, and safe. But as the morning wore on, something in the air felt different. It was subtle at first, a feeling Mitchell couldn't quite place. He brushed it off, focusing on the task at hand. He had no reason to believe that today would be any different from the thousands of days that had come before it. Scene 2: The Unwelcome Customer. The bell above the diner door chimed again, and Mitchell looked up from the grill to see a man he didn't recognize walking in. The stranger was tall, well-dressed, and black, a combination that immediately set Mitchell on edge. The man's presence seemed to disrupt the familiar rhythm of the morning. "Morning," the man said politely as he approached the counter, his voice calm and composed. Mitchell stiffened, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he turned to face the man. "What can I get you?" he asked, his tone cool and unwelcoming. "I'll just have a coffee, thanks," the man replied, taking a seat at the counter. Mitchell hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, watching to see how he would handle the situation. This wasn't the first time a black man had walked into his diner, but each time it happened, it stirred something deep within him, something he didn't like to think about. "I'm afraid we're all out," Mitchell said finally, his voice flat. The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Out of coffee?" "Out of everything," Mitchell replied, his gaze steady. The diner fell silent as the tension in the room grew. The man studied Mitchell for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I see," he said quietly, sliding off the stool. "Well, thanks anyway." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming as it closed behind him. The silence in the diner lingered for a moment longer before the murmurs of conversation resumed. Mitchell felt a sense of unease settle over him, but he quickly pushed it aside. "That's the way things are," he muttered to himself as he resumed his work. But deep down, something about the encounter gnawed at him. Scene 3: The Community's Response. By the time the lunch rush had come and gone, word of the incident at the diner had spread through the small town like wildfire. Mitchell noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations as he went about his errands later that afternoon. It wasn't long before a few of the locals began to approach him, eager to share their opinions. "Don't worry about it, Mitch," said one man, a regular customer who had been coming to the diner for years. "You did the right thing. Can't let them think they can just walk in anywhere they please." "Yeah," another woman chimed in, "we've got to keep things the way they've always been around here. That's what makes this town special." Mitchell nodded along with their words, but he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled in his gut. He had always prided himself on upholding the values his mother had taught him, values she had instilled in him from a young age. But now, for the first time, he found himself questioning whether those values were truly his own, or if they had been imposed on him by a legacy he never asked for. As he walked back to the diner, Mitchell couldn't help but notice the way some of the townspeople looked at him differently. There were a few who seemed disappointed, even angry, though they didn't say anything to him directly. The incident had clearly divided the community, and Mitchell wasn't sure how to feel about that. Scene 4, Samuel's arrival. Later that afternoon, Mitchell returned to the diner to prepare for the dinner crowd. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the empty booths. He was just about to start prepping when the bell above the door chimed again. He looked up to see an elderly black man standing in the doorway. Mitchell felt his heart skip a beat. The man was dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, but there was something about him that commanded attention. He moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone who had seen much in his lifetime. "Can I help you?" Mitchell asked, his voice more guarded than he intended. The man didn't reply right away. Instead, he took a few steps into the diner, his eyes scanning the room as if he were searching for something. Finally, he looked directly at Mitchell, his gaze steady. "My name's Samuel Brooks," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here for food. I'm here to talk to you." Mitchell frowned, unsure of what to make of this. "Talk to me? About what?" "About your father," Samuel replied, taking a seat at the counter. "And about the truth you've been kept from for far too long." Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. His father was a subject that hadn't been discussed in years, certainly not with a stranger, and certainly not with someone like Samuel. The diner felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mitchell said, his voice tight. Samuel held his gaze, unfazed by the denial. "I knew your father well," he said quietly. "Better than most. And I know the truth about why he left. I think it's time you knew too." Mitchell stared at Samuel, his mind racing. The calm demeanor of the man before him was unsettling, almost as if he knew something Mitchell didn't. But the idea of uncovering the truth about his father, a truth that had been hidden from him all his life, was too much to bear. "I don't need to know anything from you," Mitchell said sharply. "I know all I need to know about my father." Samuel's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "Maybe you do," he said, rising from his seat. "But I'll be around if you change your mind. Sometimes, the truth has a way of finding us whether we want it to or not." With that, Samuel turned and left the diner, leaving Mitchell standing there, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Scene 5, The Revelation. Night had fallen by the time Mitchell finally closed the diner and locked the doors behind him. The encounter with Samuel had left him rattled, and he found himself replaying the conversation over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his father's story than he had been told. Unable to sleep, Mitchell sat at the counter with a cup of coffee, the diner now dark and quiet. The records of his father that his mother had kept over the years were stored in a box in the back room. He had never had much interest in them before, but tonight, something compelled him to take a closer look. He retrieved the box and set it on the counter, carefully sifting through the contents. There were old photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings, all neatly organized by his mother. As he examined each item, a sense of unease began to grow within him. There were gaps in the timeline, inconsistencies that didn't make sense. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was addressed to his mother, written in his father's handwriting, but it was different from the others, its tone more somber, its words more cryptic. As Mitchell read the letter, his heart began to race. The letter hinted at a secret, something his father had kept hidden from everyone, including his own family. Mitchell set the letter down, his hands trembling. The truth that Samuel had alluded to was now becoming clearer, and it was far more unsettling than he could have imagined. The foundation of his beliefs, the very values he had built his life around, were beginning to crack. As the night wore on, Mitchell knew that he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He would have to dig deeper, confront the past, and uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. But as he prepared to embark on this journey, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if some things were better left undiscovered. Chapter 2, Digging into the Past. Scene 1, Searching for Answers. The morning after Samuel's unsettling visit, Mitchell Carter opened the diner as usual, but the routine that usually brought him comfort now felt hollow. His mind was clouded with questions, and the quiet of the early morning did nothing to ease his growing unease. The word Samuel had spoken echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. As he brewed the first pot of coffee and prepped the diner for the day, Mitchell's thoughts wandered back to the box of old family records he had sifted through the night before. The inconsistencies he had found gnawed at him, and the calm assurance he had always felt about his father's legacy was beginning to crumble. By mid-morning, the usual crowd of regulars began to fill the diner, but Mitchell found it hard to focus on their orders and small talk. He moved through the motions, serving food and refilling coffee, but his mind was elsewhere, on the past, and on the secrets it might hold. When the lunch rush came and went, Mitchell made a decision. He closed the diner early, much to the surprise of the few remaining customers, and headed to the local library. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. The library was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered among the rows of books and computers. Mitchell made his way to the section that housed the town's historical records, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. As he began to sift through old newspapers, yearbooks, and town records, his heart pounded with the possibility that he might find something, anything, that would either confirm or refute Samuel's claims. Hours passed as Mitchell combed through the records, his eyes growing tired from the strain. Just as he was about to give up, a faded newspaper clipping caught his eye. The headline was innocuous enough, but the photograph beneath it made his breath catch in his throat. There, standing beside a younger version of his father, was a woman Mitchell didn't recognize, a black woman, her hand resting on his father's arm in a gesture that spoke of familiarity and intimacy. The caption below the photograph identified the woman as a local teacher, but there was no mention of the relationship between her and Mitchell's father. Mitchell stared at the photograph for what felt like an eternity. The implications of what he was seeing began to sink in, and a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. Samuel's words were beginning to make a terrible kind of sense. Scene 2, Confronting his mother. Armed with the newspaper clipping and the confusion it had sparked, Mitchell made his way to his mother's home later that afternoon. Evelyn Carter's house was as neat and meticulously kept as ever, but to Mitchell, it now felt like a facade, a carefully constructed lie that had hidden the truth for decades. Evelyn was in the kitchen, preparing dinner when Mitchell walked in. She looked up from her work, surprised to see him. "Mitchell? What are you doing here? I wasn't expecting you." "I need to talk to you, Mom," Mitchell said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Evelyn set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and wiped her hands on a towel. "What's wrong?" she asked, sensing the tension in her son's demeanor. Mitchell didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled the newspaper clipping from his pocket and handed it to her. "Do you know anything about this?" Evelyn's face paled as she looked at the photograph. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the paper, but her expression remained stoic. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the library," Mitchell replied. "I've been looking through old records, trying to find out more about Dad. This is what I found. So tell me, Mom, who is this woman?" Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph. Finally, she set the paper down on the counter and looked up at her son. "She was just someone your father knew," she said, her voice steady but lacking conviction. "That's not good enough," Mitchell snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I need the truth, Mom. Samuel Brooks came to the diner yesterday. He told me things about Dad, things that don't add up with what you've always told me." "Who was she? What was she to him?" Evelyn's composure cracked, and she took a deep, shaky breath. "She was a mistake," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "A mistake your father made, one that nearly destroyed our family. But he ended it, he came back to us, Mitchell. He chose us." "Chose us?" Mitchell repeated, incredulous. "So you knew? You knew all along, and you never said anything? You let me believe that Dad was some kind of hero, that he left us for noble reasons when the truth is he had another life, another family?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I did what I thought was best for you," she said quietly. "You were just a boy, Mitchell. You didn't need to know all the ugly details. Your father made a choice, and I had to live with it. We both did." Mitchell felt a wave of anger and betrayal wash over him. "You didn't have the right to keep this from me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You made me believe a lie, Mom. You let me live my whole life believing in something that wasn't real." Evelyn reached out as if to comfort him, but Mitchell stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stay there any longer, he needed to get out, to think, to make sense of everything he had just learned. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving his mother standing alone in the kitchen, the weight of her lies pressing down on her. Scene 3, An Unexpected Ally. The sun was beginning to set as Mitchell made his way back into town, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He couldn't go back to the diner, not yet. The thought of returning to the place that had been the center of his life, knowing now what he did about his father, was too much to bear. Instead, he wandered through the town square, the familiar sights and sounds offering little comfort. As he walked, he spotted a figure sitting on a bench near the fountain, Samuel Brooks. Samuel looked up as Mitchell approached, a knowing expression on his face. "I take it you've been doing some digging," he said, his tone gentle. Mitchell sat down beside him, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I found a photograph," he said quietly. "A photograph of my father with a woman, a black woman. My mother knew about her, knew about the affair, but she never told me. She let me believe a lie all these years." Samuel nodded, as if he had expected this. "It's a hard truth to swallow," he said. "But it's better than living in the dark, not knowing." Mitchell looked at the older man, his emotions a turbulent mix of anger, confusion, and a growing sense of desperation. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice raw. "How do I even begin to make sense of all this?" Samuel was silent for a moment, then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "There's something I want to show you," he said. "Something that might help you understand. It's not far from here, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Your father used to go there often, back when he was seeing her." Mitchell hesitated, but something in Samuel's tone convinced him to go along. "All right," he said finally. "Show me." Scene 4, The Abandoned Farmhouse. The drive to the farmhouse was quiet, the tension between the two men palpable. As they left the town behind and the landscape turned rural, Mitchell's thoughts turned inward. What could possibly be waiting for him at this farmhouse? What more could he learn that would change the way he saw his father, his mother, and himself? The farmhouse came into view, and Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. It was an old, dilapidated structure, overgrown with weeds and partially hidden by a line of trees. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet there was something about it that felt strangely familiar. Samuel led the way as they approached the house. The front door creaked as it swung open, revealing an interior that was just as decayed as the outside. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their presence. "This is where your father would come," Samuel said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "He spent a lot of time here, more than most people knew. This was where he and she spent their time together." Mitchell's gaze swept over the room, taking in the remnants of a life he had never known existed. There were old photographs on the mantel, their edges yellowed with age. He picked one up, his heart pounding as he recognized his father's face. Beside him stood the woman from the newspaper photograph, smiling at the camera with an ease that spoke of genuine affection. "This can't be real," Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. But the evidence was there, staring him in the face. As they continued to explore the farmhouse, Mitchell found more letters, more photographs, each one a piece of the puzzle that was his father's secret life. The reality of his father's choices, of the family he had never known, began to settle heavily on his shoulders. "This was his life," Samuel said quietly, as they stood in what had once been a bedroom. "And now it's yours to make sense of. It's not going to be easy, Mitchell. But you can't run from it." Mitchell nodded slowly, the weight of Samuel's words sinking in. He had spent his whole life running from the truth, from the pain of his father's abandonment. But now, there was no more running. Scene 5, a haunting realization. Late that night, Mitchell found himself back at the diner, unable to sleep. The photographs and letters he had taken from the farmhouse lay spread out on the counter before him, each one a reminder of the life his father had kept hidden. As he looked over the evidence of his father's affair, of the half-brother he had unknowingly rejected, Mitchell felt a deep sense of regret and shame. The words he had spoken to David, the way he had treated him, all took on a new, painful significance. "I was wrong," Mitchell whispered to the empty diner. "I was so wrong." The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. His actions, his beliefs, everything he had thought was right had been built on a foundation of lies and ignorance. Now, he was left to pick up the pieces, to find a way forward. But as he sat there, the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him, Mitchell knew one thing for certain: he couldn't undo the past, but he could choose what to do with the future. And the first step was to make amends for the wrongs he had done. With a heavy heart but a newfound resolve, Mitchell began to plan his next move. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew what he had to do. It was time to confront David, to face the truth, and to begin the long journey toward redemption. Chapter 3, Confrontations. Scene 1, Seeking David. Mitchell Carter sat in his truck, the engine idling as he stared up at the sleek apartment building in the heart of the city. It was a far cry from the small-town life he was used to, the kind of place that felt foreign and intimidating. Yet here he was, miles from home, about to face the man he had wronged. David Johnson. The name now held a weight that Mitchell had never imagined. He had spent the entire drive to the city rehearsing what he would say, but now that he was here, his mind was blank. What could he possibly say to a man whose very existence he had denied? With a deep breath, Mitchell shut off the engine and stepped out of the truck. The sound of traffic filled the air, a constant hum of life that was so different from the quiet streets of his hometown. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. The elevator ride to David's floor felt like an eternity. Mitchell's heart pounded with each passing second, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out into a hallway lined with sleek, modern doors. He found the number he was looking for and hesitated for a moment before knocking. The door opened, and there stood David, his expression one of surprise. He was dressed casually, but even in his relaxed state, there was an air of composure about him that Mitchell couldn't help but admire. "Mitchell?" David's voice was calm, but there was a hint of wariness in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Mitchell cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like a schoolboy caught doing something he shouldn't. I needed to talk to you," he stammered. "About what happened at the diner, and about our father." David's expression didn't change, but he stepped aside to let Mitchell in. "Come in," he said, his tone neutral. "We can talk." Scene 2, The Difficult Conversation. The inside of David's apartment was just as sleek and modern as the building's exterior. The walls were adorned with tasteful artwork, and the furniture was minimalist yet comfortable. Mitchell felt even more out of place here, but he forced himself to focus on why he had come. David gestured for Mitchell to take a seat on the couch while he sat in a chair opposite. The silence between them was heavy, the unspoken tension palpable. I guess I'll get straight to the point, Mitchell began, his voice uncertain. I know I messed up, what I did at the diner was wrong, and I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were, and that's no excuse, but I wanted you to know that I regret it. David listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Mitchell finished, David leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's face. I appreciate the apology, he said slowly. But you're right, there's no excuse for what you did. So why are you really here, Mitchell? Is it just to apologize, or is there something more? Mitchell hesitated, then sighed. There's more, he admitted. After what happened, I started digging into our father's past. I found out things I never knew, things my mother kept from me. I found out about the affair, about you, and I realized that I've been living a lie my whole life. David's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. And now that you know the truth, what do you want from me? I don't know, Mitchell said honestly. I guess I just wanted to understand. I wanted to know more about him, about the man he really was. And I wanted to try and make things right, if that's even possible. David was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. You and I, we come from the same man, but we've lived very different lives, he said finally. I didn't know him either, my mother kept me in the dark, just like yours did with you. But here's the thing, Mitchell, we can't change what happened. We can't rewrite the past. All we can do is decide how we're going to move forward. Mitchell nodded slowly, the weight of David's words sinking in. I want to move forward, he said quietly. I don't want to be the man I've been, the man who hurt you, who lived in ignorance. I want to be better. David studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's a start, he said. But trust isn't built overnight, Mitchell. It's going to take time, and it's going to take more than words. I know, Mitchell said, his voice resolute. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Scene 3, Confronting Evelyn. The drive back to his hometown was long and filled with reflection. Mitchell replayed the conversation with David in his mind, the weight of the truth still heavy on his shoulders. But there was another confrontation he knew he couldn't avoid, one that had been building since the moment he discovered the truth about his father. When he arrived at his mother's house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. Evelyn was in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair with a book in her lap. She looked up when Mitchell entered, her expression wary. Mitchell, she said, her voice tinged with concern. What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, Mitchell replied, his voice tight. But I've seen the truth, and it's worse than any ghost. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Mitchell pulled out the photographs and letters he had taken from the farmhouse, dropping them on the coffee table in front of her. These, he said, his voice trembling with anger. These are the secrets you kept from me. The lies you told me about our family, about who our father really was. Evelyn's face paled as she looked at the evidence, but she remained silent. You knew about the affair, Mitchell continued, his voice rising. You knew about David, about everything, and you kept it from me. You let me believe in a lie, all because you couldn't face the truth yourself. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. I did what I thought was best, she said defensively. I was trying to protect you, Mitchell. You were just a child, how could I burden you with something like that? Protect me? Mitchell shouted. You weren't protecting me, you were protecting yourself. You were too proud, too bitter to admit the truth. And because of that, I grew up hating a man I didn't even know. I hurt people, I hurt David, all because you couldn't face the truth. Evelyn finally broke down, her tears flowing freely. I'm sorry, Mitchell, she sobbed. I was angry, I was hurt, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But you're right, I should have told you the truth. I should have been honest with you. Mitchell's anger began to ebb as he watched his mother cry. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so broken. And despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. "We can't change the past, Mom," he said quietly, his voice softening. "But we can try to make things right. We can try to be better." Evelyn nodded, her tears still falling. "I want to make things right," she whispered. "I want to be better too." Scene 4, the community reacts. The next day, word of Mitchell's discoveries and his connection to David had spread through the small town like wildfire. The diner, once a place of routine and comfort, had become a battleground of opinions and judgment. Some of the regulars who had once supported Mitchell now looked at him with suspicion, while others seemed to admire his willingness to confront his past. The tension was palpable, and every conversation was laced with whispers and speculation. "Is it true, Mitchell?" one customer asked as he poured a cup of coffee. "Is that black man really your brother?" Mitchell nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes, it's true. His name is David, and he's my half-brother. I'm not proud of how I treated him, but I'm trying to make things right." The customer nodded slowly, processing the information. "Well, it takes guts to admit when you're wrong," he said. "Not everyone's willing to do that." Mitchell appreciated the support, but he knew that not everyone in town would be so understanding. The diner had always been a place where people came to feel at home, to be surrounded by familiarity. But now, it had become a place where the town's deepest divisions were laid bare. As the day wore on, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be the same. The truth had a way of changing everything, and he was beginning to realize that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. Scene 5, a moment of reflection. That evening, Mitchell found himself drawn back to the abandoned farmhouse. The place that had once been a symbol of secrecy and betrayal now felt like a place of reckoning, a place where he could confront the past and begin to make peace with it. He sat on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against his skin as he looked out at the overgrown fields. The silence was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. As he sat there, Mitchell thought about his father, about the man he had been and the man he had pretended to be. He thought about his mother, about the choices she had made and the lies she had told. And he thought about David, the brother he had never known, the brother he had wronged. The weight of it all was heavy, but for the first time in a long time, Mitchell felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he had to do, he had to make things right, not just with David, but with himself. He had to break the cycle of hatred and ignorance that had defined his life for so long. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Mitchell made a silent vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to build a relationship with David, to heal the wounds of the past, and to create a future that was different from the one he had been given. The journey wouldn't be easy, but Mitchell was ready to face it. For the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, a path that would lead to redemption, forgiveness, and, ultimately, a new beginning. Chapter 4, Making Amends. Scene 1, Reaching Out. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of David's apartment as Mitchell stood nervously outside the door. This time, he wasn't here to dredge up the past, he was here to take a step toward the future, however uncertain that future might be. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to try. After a deep breath, Mitchell knocked on the door. A few moments later, David answered, his expression neutral as he took in the sight of his half-brother standing in the hallway once again. "Mitchell," David said, his voice even. "Back again so soon?" Mitchell nodded, forcing a small, tentative smile. "Yeah. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. I know I have a lot to make up for, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or maybe ever. But I want to try. I want to build something new between us, if you're willing." David studied Mitchell for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said simply. The two men sat down in the living room, the atmosphere between them charged with unspoken tension. Mitchell wasn't sure where to begin, but he knew that the first step was to acknowledge the past while looking toward the future. "I'm sorry," Mitchell began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything, for the way I treated you, for the things I said, and for not being the kind of person you deserve to have in your life. I can't change the past, but I want to be better. I want to be someone you can trust." David nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not easy to hear those words, but I appreciate them," he replied. "Trust isn't something that happens overnight, Mitchell. It takes time, and it takes effort. But I'm willing to give you a chance, if you're willing to do the work." Mitchell felt a surge of relief, though he knew that this was only the beginning. "I am," he said firmly. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." David's expression softened slightly. "Then let's start with something simple," he said. "Why don't we get to know each other? Not as enemies, but as brothers. We can take it one step at a time." Mitchell nodded, grateful for the opportunity. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd really like that." Scene 2, Revisiting the Diner. Later that afternoon, Mitchell stood behind the counter of his diner, his mind racing with thoughts of the conversation he had just had with David. He knew that trust would be hard to earn, but he was determined to make the changes necessary to rebuild his relationship with his half-brother. As the lunch rush began to taper off, Mitchell glanced at the door, his heart skipping a beat when he saw David walk in. The atmosphere in the diner shifted immediately, the regulars growing quiet as they noticed David's presence. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, while others watched in silence, unsure of what to make of the situation. David approached the counter, his expression calm but guarded. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, gesturing to an empty stool. Mitchell smiled, though he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Of course. Sit anywhere you like." David took a seat, and Mitchell poured him a cup of coffee, setting it in front of him with a steady hand. The tension in the diner was palpable, but Mitchell ignored it, focusing instead on the simple act of serving his brother. "Thanks," David said, taking a sip of the coffee. Mitchell nodded, leaning on the counter as he spoke. "I know this is awkward," he admitted. "But I wanted to bring you here because this place, it's important to me. It's been my whole life. And I want you to be a part of it, if you're willing." David looked around the diner, taking in the retro decor, the old jukebox, and the photographs on the walls. "This place has a lot of history," he said quietly. "I can see why it means so much to you." "It does," Mitchell replied. "But I know that history isn't perfect. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I'm ready to make things right." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all have our pasts, Mitchell. The important thing is what we do moving forward. I'm here because I'm willing to see where this goes, one step at a time." As they continued to talk, the other customers slowly began to relax, returning to their meals and conversations. The tension in the air began to dissipate, and for the first time, Mitchell felt a sense of hope that things could change, that he could change. Scene 3, A Mother's Reckoning. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Mitchell returned to his mother's house. The conversation with David had given him a renewed sense of purpose, but there was still one more person he needed to face before he could truly move forward. Evelyn had been avoiding him since their last confrontation, but Mitchell knew that they couldn't keep running from each other forever. He found her in the kitchen, as he had so many times before, but this time, the air between them was heavy with unspoken tension. "Mom," Mitchell said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." Evelyn looked up, her expression weary. "I know," she replied, her voice tinged with resignation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we last spoke. I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count. And I'm sorry for that, Mitchell. I'm sorry for everything." Mitchell felt a pang of sympathy for his mother, but he knew that this conversation needed to happen. "We can't change what's already happened," he said gently. "But we can try to make things right. I've talked to David, and we're trying to build something new, something better. Evelyn nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I want to be a part of that, she said, her voice trembling. I've held on to so much anger, so much bitterness, and it's poisoned everything. I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to be better, for you, and for David. Mitchell reached out, taking his mother's hand in his. We can all be better, he said softly. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take work. Are you ready for that? Evelyn squeezed his hand, her tears spilling over. I am, she whispered. I'm ready. The two of them stood there for a moment, holding on to each other as the weight of the past began to lift. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Mitchell felt a sense of peace, a sense that they were all on the right path. Scene 4, A New Family. The next evening, Mitchell, David, and Samuel stood together in the abandoned farmhouse, the remnants of the past surrounding them. The old photographs and letters that had once been a source of pain and confusion were now laid out before them, a tangible connection to the family they had never known. This place holds a lot of memories, Samuel said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. Some good, some bad. But it's a part of who we are, who you are, Mitchell. Mitchell nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room. I've spent so much of my life running from the past, he admitted. But I think it's time to face it, to make peace with it. David stepped forward, picking up one of the old photographs. We can't change what happened, he said softly. But we can learn from it. We can take the lessons of the past and use them to build something new, something better. As they continued to sort through the belongings, the three men shared stories, memories, and reflections. They talked about the man who had connected them all, the man who had made mistakes but had also loved in his own flawed way. For the first time, Mitchell felt a sense of connection to both his father and his newfound family. The farmhouse, once a symbol of secrecy and betrayal, had become a place of healing, a place where they could come together and begin to forge a new path forward. Scene 5, A New Beginning. The following morning, Mitchell and David stood side by side in the diner, preparing for the day ahead. The atmosphere was lighter, the tension that had once hung over them beginning to dissipate. The regular customers, who had once been wary, were now starting to accept the changes that had come to the diner, and to Mitchell's life. As they worked together, Mitchell couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The journey had been difficult, filled with pain and uncertainty, but it had also been filled with growth, understanding, and the possibility of something new. We've come a long way, David said, his voice thoughtful as he wiped down the counter. Mitchell nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We have, he agreed. And we've got a long way to go. But I'm glad we're doing it together. David returned the smile, a sense of camaraderie settling between them. Me too, he said simply. As the first customers of the day began to trickle in, Mitchell felt a sense of hope, hope that the diner, once a place of division, could become a place of connection and community. Hope that the future, however uncertain, held the promise of continued growth and understanding. And as he looked around the diner, at the people who had become a part of his life, Mitchell knew that while the past couldn't be changed, the future was theirs to shape. Chapter 5, A New Legacy. Scene 1, The Town Meeting. The town hall was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Mitchell Carter stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding as he watched the proceedings unfold. He had been coming to these meetings for years, but never before had he felt the need to speak up, until now. As the discussion turned to race relations and the town's history, Mitchell knew this was his moment. He had spent the last few months confronting his own prejudices, building bridges with David, and reconciling with his mother. Now, it was time to take a stand publicly. The mayor, a well-dressed man with a booming voice, addressed the crowd. We've all seen the changes happening in our community, he said. And while some of those changes are good, there are also concerns. We need to make sure we're preserving the traditions that make our town special. Mitchell felt a surge of anger at the mayor's words. He knew all too well what those traditions were, and they were anything but special. They were rooted in fear, in hatred, and in a refusal to change. Before he could second-guess himself, Mitchell raised his hand. The mayor spotted him and nodded, signaling for him to speak. Mitchell cleared his throat, his voice shaky but determined. "I'd like to say something," he began, the room falling silent as everyone turned to look at him. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and for a long time, I believed in those traditions. But I've learned something recently, something that's changed the way I see the world." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We can't hold on to the past at the expense of our future. We need to be better, to do better. It's time to let go of the hatred and fear that's held us back for so long. We need to come together as a community, to support one another, regardless of the color of our skin." The room was silent for a moment, and Mitchell could feel the weight of every gaze on him. Then, slowly, a few people began to nod, and a ripple of approval spread through the crowd. Not everyone was on board, but that didn't matter. Mitchell had taken his stand, and that was enough. Scene 2, an unlikely partnership. The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise as Mitchell and David stood together outside the diner. The events of the town meeting were still fresh in Mitchell's mind, but now his focus was on the future, on the new partnership he and David had decided to embark on. "I've been thinking about some changes we can make," David said, his tone thoughtful. "The diner has a lot of history, but I think there's room for improvement. We can keep the things that make it special, but also make it more inclusive, a place where everyone feels welcome." Mitchell nodded, his heart swelling with pride at the idea. "I'm with you," he said. "Let's make this place something we can both be proud of." They spent the morning working side by side, discussing ideas and making plans. Mitchell could see the excitement in David's eyes, and he felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing from his life for so long. The diner had always been his domain, but now it was becoming something more, a symbol of their new beginning. As the day went on, customers began to trickle in. Some of the regulars still seemed hesitant, but others were starting to warm up to the changes. Mitchell knew it would take time, but he was confident that they were on the right path. Scene 3, honoring the past. That afternoon, Mitchell and David drove out to the abandoned farmhouse, with Samuel sitting quietly in the back seat. The old house had become a place of reflection and connection for them, and now they were ready to take the next step, to restore it and honor the past in a way that would help heal the wounds of the community. The farmhouse was as dilapidated as ever, but Mitchell could see the potential in it, the potential to become a place of learning, of growth, and of reconciliation. "We can turn this into something special," David said as they stepped out of the car. "A place where people can come to learn about the history of the town, the good and the bad. A place where we can start to heal." Samuel nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "He made mistakes, but he loved you both. And I think he'd be happy to see you working together like this." Mitchell felt a lump in his throat as he looked at the old house. The memories it held were painful, but they were also a part of who he was, who they all were. By restoring it, they could turn that pain into something positive, something that would help others. "We'll do it," Mitchell said, his voice firm. "We'll make it a place where the past can be remembered, but not repeated." Scene 4, a family united. That evening, Mitchell and David returned to Evelyn's home. The past few months had been a journey of healing and reconciliation, and now it was time to take the final step, to bring David into the family. The atmosphere was tense as they entered the house, but Mitchell was determined to make this work. Evelyn greeted them at the door, her expression wary but hopeful. She had been working to change, to confront her own prejudices, and Mitchell could see the effort it had taken. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry for everything. For the lies, for the way I treated you. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I forgive you," he said, his voice gentle. "It's not going to be easy, but I want to be a part of this family. We can start fresh, together. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she stepped forward, embracing David for the first time. Mitchell watched, his heart full as the two people he cared about most finally found common ground. They sat down together for dinner, the atmosphere warm and filled with hope. The past was still there, but it no longer held the power to divide them. They were a family, united by their willingness to change, to grow, and to build a future together. Scene 5, looking forward. The next day, the diner was busier than it had been in years. Mitchell, David, and Samuel worked together, serving a bustling crowd of customers. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, and the tension that had once plagued the diner was gone. As Mitchell handed a plate of food to a customer, he took a moment to look around. The diner, once a symbol of division and hatred, had become a place of community and connection. It was a testament to the journey they had all taken, a journey that had been difficult, but ultimately rewarding. David caught Mitchell's eye and smiled, a look of understanding passing between them. They had come a long way, and while the future was still uncertain, they knew they could face it together. Mitchell felt a sense of peace settle over him as he returned to work. The past could not be changed, but the future was theirs to shape. And with David and Samuel by his side, he knew they would continue to grow, to learn, and to build a legacy they could all be proud of.